The border region in the Baltic states is generally a quite interesting one. Over the decades and centuries, states have dissolved and re-emerged here. At times they were annexed and later returned, and their borders repeatedly shifted in one direction or the other. In some cases, these changes were the result of years of negotiation. However, if you take a look at the map, there is one place that still stands out from all this border confusion. And that is, you see it? Right, this little unusual corner here. In the very east of Lithuania, there is a tiny region that juts out like a small island into the neighboring country of Belarus and is therefore also an external EU border. Anyone who wants to enter this area has to pass through this small gap, which is just 3 kilometers wide, and then finds himself in a place that is completely surrounded by Belarus, and in a place where somehow time seems to have stood still. This little island is also called the Dieveniškės Appendix, named after a little village within this island. And this island also shows quite good what actually happened here geographically within the past decades, because borders were redrawn over and over again in this area, sometimes through entire villages, and well, this little spot on the map is basically the relic of that. Today, in this video, I will tell you all the big and little secrets of this unusual border area. Why was this border drawn like that? How's the situation there today, right next to Belarus? And plot twist, why is everybody speaking Polish there and not Lithuanian? Well, there's a lot to talk about. Okay, let's start our little tour through the Dieveniškės Appendix. I booked a hotel right next to this appendix, but not inside it, so we have to go there. And I have actually no idea what we can actually see there today, and also how close we can get to the border and stuff like that. As you might have seen in my latest video from the Russian Kaliningrad border, people in the border area are quite nervous. I had to go through a police control and there was also an alarm when I was standing right next to the border. And I'm pretty sure the situation here next to Belarus is not that different. So I really don't know what we can actually see there today. But the interesting thing is, to get to this appendix, we have to take a road, basically the only road that leads there. And this road is like 2 or 3 meters right next to the border with Belarus. So I really don't know how that is to drive along there. Let's try it and let's see what will happen today. Well, and even though I knew that this could become a quite complicated trip again, I still approached it very naively. Of course, I knew that it will probably be not possible to walk around right next to the border fence, but what surprised me was that it's not even easy to get into this part of the country. There is actually a border control on the road that leads into this appendix. It's not even a new development, it's here for many, many years. The official reason for this is to prevent smuggling. And if I had taken a closer look at this area on Google Street View beforehand, which is also where these pictures come from, I might have saved myself the trouble that followed. Hi, hello. I'm a journalist and I actually wanted to visit this appendix to do some recordings and do a little documentary. Is it allowed to go there or not?
Wait a minute.
Yeah. So, what happened exactly? Well, I communicated with a friendly Lithuanian border official. Well, communicating is perhaps the wrong word. We wrote via Google Translator because the border officials didn't speak any English at all. He then ran off with my ID card and vehicle documents and checked them for like 10 to 15 minutes in his little hut with his colleagues. And then at some point he came back and told me the following. I am allowed to drive into this appendix, but filming and photography are strictly forbidden near the border. If they catch me doing photos or videos, there will be a, and I quote, big fine. The only option would have been to get a filming permission for this in advance through some kind of process. But as I already said, I didn't really expect that, and that wasn't an option for my short stay here. Apart from the film ban, I was also strictly advised not to drive into this area at all. This is a, quote, high security zone. It's better not to drive here, said the border official. I suspect this has something to do with the Russian war against Ukraine, which also affects the border area right next to Belarus. More on that later. But of course, I didn't drive all the way here and then turn round again. So I decided to drive into this border region, be careful, and I decided to record at least a short podcast for you and describe what you can actually see in this area, even if I can't film it. So, when you drive into this appendix, you first pass many green meadows and forests. And there is absolutely nobody on the road. I came across maybe 2 or 3 cars on my entire tour. It really feels like the end of the world. And after just a few minutes of driving, you reach the place that I was just talking about. The Lithuanian-Belarusian border, which is right next to the road. I show you a Google Street View image here because I wasn't allowed to film it myself. It's a really strange feeling to drive along here. You're driving through absolutely nowhere, and then suddenly this heavy secured barbed wire fence appears out of nowhere. And you know immediately you can't go any further. This is the end. The end of Lithuania, the end of the EU, and it also feels a bit like the end of the world. Well, I then drove through this area for an hour or so. It went relatively smoothly, so there were no further controls or people who were obviously watching me. I drove almost to the end of this area, where there is also a castle. However, the officer told me that I shouldn't walk around there because the castle is right next to the border, so I didn't. What is interesting is that the further you drive into this area, the more remote it seems. At some point, I actually passed horse-drawn carriages, which are apparently still used for farming here. And I came across an area where there were lots of abandoned farmhouses and barns. I think these are still relics from Soviet times. More on that later. This area here is obviously also highly religious. There are crosses everywhere along the roads. Well, and then I finished my trip by traveling to the place that gives this whole island its name, Dieveniškės. This is a tiny village that stretches around a rectangular square. There is a church here, a small supermarket, and a school. And I at least tried to have a little small talk here with 1 or 2 people on the road about this unusual place. But once again, this was more difficult than I thought because absolutely nobody speaks a word of English here. Hi, do you speak English?
Babe?
English? Do you speak English? No?
Babe?
Well, and after this quite disappointing and also a bit confusing trip, I decided to go back to the border control point, where I once again came into contact with my new friend, the border guard. Thank you, I'm finished.
Please open the trunk.
Yeah. This is just my jacket and okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Okay, that was a very weird tour. I'm outside the appendix now, so there are no controls anymore and I'm allowed to film again, so everything is safe. But yeah, that really was a very strange tour and I really have to process my feelings about it. And Anyway, I think now it's time to take a look at the historical aspect of this whole border situation here. And the most interesting question is, of course, why is this strange border actually here? How did this happen? And there is actually a quite funny story that is told about this here in the area, even though it is not really true. But let's start with the facts first. And for that, we go back to the year 1920, the time after the First World War. At this time, the borders in the region are quite confused, and each country has its own ideas how the borders should be drawn in the future. In 1920, therefore, a peace agreement is concluded between Poland and Lithuania, the so-called Suwałki Treaty. On the one hand, it regulates various border demarcations, and on the other, it is intended to bring about a ceasefire. The problem, before this agreement even comes into force, Poland breaks it and invades the Vilnius region, which also includes our unusual border region here. As a result, the region belongs to Poland for almost 20 years. And as I already mentioned, you can still see that today. There are still around 213,000 people with Polish roots living in Lithuania today, and the majority of them lives here in this border region, which also answers the question from the beginning. This is exactly why Polish is the main language spoken here. In 1939, however, this chapter of history ends. Germany begins the Second World War, and in the same year, a pact is signed between the German Reich and the Soviet Union. Poland is partitioned, and after the occupation of Eastern Poland, the Vilnius region comes under Soviet control. In a further agreement, it is stipulated that the Soviet Union will return the Vilnius region and the city itself to Lithuania. However, there is a plan behind this. The Soviet Union wants to bind Lithuania more closely to itself and secure its own military and political interests in the region. And so it happens. Just a year later, Lithuania is completely occupied by the Soviet Union and becomes part of it. And now we come to the story, which is probably not really true, but nevertheless quite entertaining. When the borders around the Vilnius region were redrawn in the year 1939, Stalin's pipe supposedly was lying on the map, and the officials tasked with drawing the border were reportedly too terrified to move it. So they simply drew a line around the pipe, and that, according to the locals' story, is how this little island was created. A story still told to this day. The true story behind this weird border is a little less spectacular. In fact, there has been a dispute over this area for years, and when it comes to the border, even the residents in this area play a quite important role. The Lithuanian news site 15 Minutes has researched this whole topic. In 1939, before Lithuania joins the Soviet Union, the border between Lithuania and the Soviet Union runs near the town of Chalchilinkeli. Many of today's Lithuanian villages, such as Dieveniškės, lie on the territory of Soviet Belarus at this time. The Lithuanians in this ethnically mixed region, however, don't really like that, and they protest. And well, when Lithuania joins the Soviet Union in 1940, Belarus really cedes around 3,000 square kilometers of territory with 80,000 inhabitants to Lithuania. But this does not bring peace to the region. During the German occupation from 1942 to 1944, the borders shift again. An entire area of what was originally Belarus becomes part of Lithuania. After the Second World War, the borders continued to be redrawn. At this time, however, all this happens within the Soviet Union, so the borders do not hold the same significance as they do today. The island we see today likely takes shape around 1956, as researched by 15 Minutes. At that time, the area is part of a collective farm. In the Soviet Union, these farms were large-scale agricultural cooperatives. You might remember those abandoned houses and barns I showed you earlier. I suspect that at least some of them date back to this period. And well, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this little island remains. The now independent states of Belarus and Lithuania negotiate the new border line, and a bilateral treaty comes into force in April 1996. And this treaty still preserves this small island as we see it today. In total, the borders in this region shifted 5 times within a few decades after 1939. Some older people who live here have changed countries 3 or 4 times in their lives without even moving. Sometimes they lived in Poland, sometimes in the USSR, sometimes in Lithuania, sometimes in Belarus, and this unusual island on the map remains a relic of all these turbulent changes. All this back and forth, of course, also had an impact on the residents in this area. Because borders were moved, also villages were separated during this time, which means neighborhoods, but even families were divided. This was not such a big deal during Soviet times, and even after that, the rules at the borders were not that strict. But when Lithuania finally became part of the EU, things got really complicated. The 15 Minutes article also quotes some local residents here in the region. For example, a man from Nordviliškės who always has to speak to his aunt across the border fence because visiting her on the other side would be far too inconvenient. Another resident reports that she no longer visits her relatives on the Belarusian side at all, simply because it's too expensive. A journey from here to the nearest official border crossing and a visa, which you also need, costs a total of 174 euros, money that many people in this rather poor region simply don't have. One woman is even still married to her husband, who now lives on the other side of the border. A divorce is also not really possible, as it would also be too expensive. And today, the situation in the border area is even more complicated, and well, that's also what I experienced today. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Belarus is a close ally of Russia. Since that day, also the security measures here at the border have been heavily increased. Just a few months ago, in March 2024, Lithuania closed 2 more border crossings with Belarus, leaving only the Medininkai and Chalchininkai crossings open. However, the routes there have been tightened once again, non-scheduled bus services are restricted, and crossing the border into the EU on foot or by bicycle is prohibited. There is also no getting through here in the Dieveniškės appendix today. Take a look here. This is what the border crossing here looked like in 2012, and this is what it looks like in 2022. It's closed. According to official statements, Lithuania wants to prevent smuggling, enforce international sanctions, and strengthen national security. According to Lithuania, the danger comes in particular from the Russian mercenary group Wagner, which still has a handful of mercenaries stationed in Belarus. However, Lithuania also wants to protect itself against the Russian and Belarusian hybrid warfare. Belarus is accused of deliberately pushing migrants towards the EU border in order to increase pressure on the EU and create division. For this reason, Lithuania has massively tightened its border fortifications and erected high fences, with success, as the country says. Here in the small island of Dieveniškės, however, the situation today is even more complicated for local residents, and it is unlikely that the situation will improve anytime soon. So, here we are back in the hotel. A hotel with this beautiful golden wall. Isn't it great? Yeah. What a day, right? That was a really interesting but also quite confusing day. But that's how it is. I always wanted to visit those border regions here. I wanted to learn about them. I wanted to see how life is here because I read so much about them. And I knew it could be complicated to visit these regions. And well, I was right. That's how it is. Anyway, I hope you liked my video anyway, and I hope you learned something. If you did, then please leave a thumbs up. You can also hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss any upcoming video. And if you like to support me and my work, you can also do that, for example, on Patreon. There's a link down in the description, or you can become a channel member on my YouTube channel. There's also a button somewhere here. Then you will also get exclusive stuff and new videos before everyone else. So yeah, you should check that out. But that's it for today, and there will be one more border video from this series. I hope it will be a bit more relaxed. I really don't want to discuss with border officers anymore. But yeah, we will see. So far, I would say have a safe journey and see you next time.